I'm Christopher, and today's video covers the worst snake attacks ever recorded, from a man who spent months deliberately exposing himself to snake bites in a dangerous attempt to build immunity, to a repairman who ignored months of unsettling sounds and strange odors creeping closer to his home each night. It was May 17, 2013, and the dense banana plantation across Costa Rica's Limon province had become a maze where hidden dangers lurked among towering stalks. One of Central America's deadliest snakes lay motionless in the undergrowth, waiting for a worker to pass too close. Mateo Rivas, 38, had 15 years on the plantations, moving faster than most through thick foliage. That morning, he aimed to finish early for extra overtime. His confidence in familiar terrain made him underestimate the danger waiting ahead, perfectly camouflaged. I keep thinking about how that familiarity probably blinded him to the predator lurking silently. The section Mateo worked was dense, with sunlight barely reaching the ground and fallen leaves hiding a massive fer de lance. Recent rain had pushed wildlife closer, and vipers had been spotted nearby. Warnings and signs of disturbed foliage should have made him cautious, but he moved efficiently, machete in hand, unaware of the predator just feet away. I can picture him stepping through the undergrowth, confident, yet blind to the danger ahead. The viper struck without warning. Mateo's left foot landed within striking distance, and the snake's fangs sank deep into his lower leg, injecting a massive dose of hemotoxic venom. The initial shock was probably confusing. He might have thought he had stepped on a thorn or broken branch, but within moments, the pain became unbearable. A burning, spreading agony that radiated up his leg. Swelling rose quickly, discoloration darkening the surrounding tissue, and a creeping sense of dread set in. I can't imagine the realization hitting him. The sharp, shocking understanding that this was no ordinary injury, that something lethal had pierced him, and there was nothing he could do to escape the consequences. Each heartbeat must have amplified the fear. Each second, a reminder of the venom coursing through his veins, systematically destroying tissue and attacking his very life. He tried to keep working, tried to push through, but the venom spread quickly. His legs swelled grotesquely, blood failed to clot, and tissue destruction began almost immediately. His heart raced, dizziness set in, and strength drained from his limbs. When his co-workers reached him, he was barely able to sit upright against a banana stalk. I can picture the panic in their eyes as they tried to carry him toward the road, knowing every moment counted, the hours stretching agonizingly as his body betrayed him. The journey to the clinic was brutal. Mateo's condition worsened with every step. Internal bleeding, shock, and organ strain left him barely conscious. By the time he arrived, massive envenomation and tissue destruction had overwhelmed him. Even with anti-venom and urgent care, it was too late. I keep imagining how powerless he must have felt, his body giving out with nothing able to stop it. The remote location and poor roads had made rapid help impossible. Doctors confirmed complete tissue necrosis, blood vessel damage, and systemic organ failure. I can't stop picturing that morning. The rustling banana leaves, the oppressive quiet after his last step. Afterward, the plantation increased safety training and protective equipment requirements, but nothing could bring Mateo back. His family received compensation, though it couldn't replace his presence or income. Among co-workers, the incident left a lasting impression. Workers now approached dense patches with caution, remembering how quickly a familiar landscape could turn lethal. The plantation, once just a place of routine labor, became a reminder that hidden dangers could lurk in even the most mundane corners of life. It's haunting to imagine how ordinary work turned deadly in an instant, and how quickly a place he knew so well became lethal. I keep replaying it in my mind. The calm, the quiet, and then that single bite changing everything forever. Even today, I think about the patterns of the leaves, the shadows along the ground, and how the snake's camouflage allowed it to remain undetected until it was too late. It's a stark reminder that confidence and experience can never replace caution when you're dealing with forces far stronger than yourself. One wrong step, one overlooked warning, and the consequences are irreversible. It was November 2nd, 2018, when the cool autumn evening settled over Gregor Vandermeer's sprawling property in rural Oregon, about 40 miles south of Portland. The converted barn that served as his reptile breeding facility hummed with heat lamps and climate control systems. Gregor, 45, had spent 2 decades building his reputation as one of the premier python breeders in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in reticulated pythons, the longest snake species on Earth. His operation was modest but profitable, selling juvenile pythons to collectors across the country. His pride and joy was a 20-foot female he had raised from a hatchling over 18 years, a snake he called Empress. She was the foundation of his entire breeding program, and he treated her with a reverence that bordered on obsession. Those who knew Gregor described him as meticulous and safety-conscious, except when it came to Empress. He had built her a dedicated room in the barn, 20 by 15 feet, with heated floors and climbing structures. Unlike his other snakes, Empress had free reign of her space. Gregor entered regularly to clean, conduct health checks, and feed her, always alone, dismissing the long-standing rule that giant constrictors should never be handled without a second person present. Fellow breeders had warned him repeatedly. Gregor insisted he knew Empress better than anyone. On the evening of November 2nd, Gregor prepared her weekly meal, a 15-pound thawed rabbit, and carried it into her room using tongs to keep the scent off his hands. Empress was coiled near her basking spot, her body forming loops nearly 18 inches in diameter. Her tongue flicked as she detected the food. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with large females reaching 20 feet or more and weighing between 150 and 200 pounds. They kill by constriction, not by crushing bones, as commonly believed, but by tightening with each exhale of their prey, preventing the lungs from re-expanding. Death typically follows within minutes, from cardiac arrest and asphyxiation combined. Multiple human fatalities from captive specimens are documented in the United States. Gregor placed the rabbit on the floor about 6 feet from Empress's head and stepped back. As he moved toward the door, his boot caught the edge of a water dish he had forgotten to move. He stumbled, and the sudden movement triggered Empress. She lunged, striking his thigh with her head. The impact knocked him off balance. He fell hard onto his side, and before he could scramble upright, her body was already moving around him. The first coil wrapped his chest and right arm, pinning it to his side. He tried to push free with his left arm, but a second coil came around his neck and upper chest. He tried to call out. The pressure on his lungs reduced it to a gasp. A third coil took his waist and legs. Empress tightened with every breath he gave up. His ribs began to fracture under the sustained pressure, first one, then several in rapid succession. At least one punctured his left lung, which collapsed. The coils around his neck compressed his carotid arteries. His vision darkened. His struggles weakened. Within roughly a minute to 90 seconds, he lost consciousness. Death came within minutes, from a combination of asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. He would not have been aware of it. Empress held her constriction for some time after he died, typical behavior, ensuring prey is fully still before releasing. She then began attempting to swallow him head first, working her jaws forward in the slow, methodical way large constrictors do. His shoulders proved too wide to continue. After an extended effort, she gave up and retreated to her basking spot. Gregor's business partner discovered the scene the following morning when Gregor failed to answer their scheduled call. Animal control officers, working with experienced reptile handlers, sedated Empress and removed her safely. The autopsy recorded multiple rib fractures, a collapsed lung, compression injury to the trachea, and cardiac arrest consistent with constriction. Empress was eventually relocated to a specialized reptile conservation facility, operating under protocols requiring multiple handlers for any interaction with large constrictors. The incident renewed debate across the reptile keeping community, and several states tightened ownership requirements in the years that followed. Gregor van der Meer had known Empress longer than some of his colleagues had kept snakes at all. He had fed her, cleaned her space, monitored her health through 2 decades of seasons. None of it changed what she was or what she did when he fell. It was May 18, 2015, the air thick with humidity, as monsoon rains hammered the rice paddies outside Alappuzha, Kerala. By late afternoon, 7-year-old Ananya Pillai would be fighting for breath on the dirt floor of her family's home. Ananya was the youngest child of subsistence farmers who worked the paddies surrounding their modest concrete and thatch home. Her father spent long hours bent over rice plants. Her mother sold vegetables at the village market on weekends. Money was perpetually scarce. Ananya had never been to a doctor, relying instead on local healers and home remedies when illness struck. She was small for her age, with cropped dark hair and perpetually bare feet, known in the village for her restless energy and tendency to wander. That particular May, tensions ran high in the Pillai household. The monsoon had arrived early, flooding portions of their land and threatening the season's yield. Neighbors said that her parents argued frequently about money and debts, their voices rising late into the night. During these episodes, Ananya and her older brother Arav, age 10, often slipped outside to escape the tension, playing in the fields until darkness forced them home. That afternoon, Ananya and Arav had been told to stay inside, while their parents worked a neighbor's field in exchange for borrowed equipment. The children obeyed for perhaps an hour before boredom drove them outside. The rain had stopped temporarily, leaving everything dripping and fragrant with wet earth. They headed toward their favorite spot, a shallow trench where water collected and small fish became trapped, easy to catch with bare hands. Arav walked slightly ahead, testing the depth with a stick. Ananya followed directly behind, her feet making soft sucking sounds in the mud. The children played next to waist-high wild grass, where neighbors had recently spotted cobras. The spectacled cobra, one of India's most dangerous snakes, can grow 5 feet and carries neurotoxic venom. During monsoon floods, they leave burrows for higher ground or dense vegetation. When threatened or stepped on, they strike with lightning speed, and untreated bites carry over 50% mortality. The trench water was murky from rainfall. Arav bent toward a fish shape, and Ananya stepped forward. A cobra, likely sheltering from birds of prey, was coiled in the shallow trench. Her foot came within inches, triggering a reflex strike. Fangs pierced just above her ankle, venom entering the tissue. Ananya yelped, jerking her leg and stumbling into deeper water. Arav spun around and saw the cobra's distinctive hood flared, its cream-colored spectacle markings clearly visible before it retreated into the grass. He screamed for his parents, his voice cracking with terror, then grabbed Ananya's arm and pulled her toward shore. 2 small puncture wounds on her foot leaked droplets of blood mixed with clear venom. A neighbor working nearby heard Arav's screams and ran to alert the Pillai parents. They arrived within 10 minutes, finding both children on the muddy bank, Ananya already complaining of tingling spreading up her leg. Her father identified the bite immediately. He said that he had seen cobra strikes before. However, they can't afford the possible medical bills. Instead, they carried Ananya home. Her mother ground neem leaves and turmeric into a paste and applied it to the wound, an old remedy passed down through generations, used out of desperation, despite offering no real protection against venom. Her father fetched the village elder, who performed prayers and made small incisions around the bite to let bad blood flow out, a ritual believed to help, but which instead caused additional harm and delay. As the first hour passed, the tissue around the bite grew firm and swollen. The second hour brought vomiting and excessive salivation. By the third hour, the neurotoxic effects had progressed beyond the possibility of reversal without medical intervention. Ananya lost the ability to form words, her facial muscles going slack. Her eyelids began to droop, and she could not keep them open, and her speech became slurred. Breathing became labored as the venom attacked the nerves controlling her respiratory muscles. Her parents finally understood the gravity of the situation and sent a neighbor running to find transportation, but it was far too late. Ananya's breathing grew shallow as venom paralyzed her diaphragm. She lost consciousness, lips turning blue, and about 4.5 hours after the bite, breathing stopped. Attempts to revive her failed. An auxiliary nurse midwife arrived nearly an hour later, documenting death from snakebite-related asphyxiation and noting delayed medical care. The unofficial cause, respiratory failure from cobra envenomation, worsened by inadequate treatment. The Pillai family held a simple funeral ceremony at their home the following day. Community members gathered briefly, but such deaths were not uncommon in rural Kerala. The paddies where Ananya was bitten remained a popular play area for children, as no visible signs of the incident remained, and families continued to rely on the area for daily life. It was March 12, 2017, and by 9 that evening, Fort Lauderdale emergency room physician would be on the phone with a toxicologist in Melbourne, trying to identify a venom for which no American hospital kept a stock of appropriate anti-venom because no one in this country was supposed to have the snake. Marcus Camus, 34, worked as an HVAC technician out of Fort Lauderdale and had spent the better part of a decade building a reptile collection that lived in the gap between legal and not. I'm always surprised how people keep getting away with harboring illegal animals in America despite strict laws. His converted garage held roughly 20 snakes, most permitted under Florida law, a few not. And in those few was a juvenile inland taipan, kept in a locked plastic tub inside a secondary lockable cabinet, labeled Cayman as a decoy. Marcus had no formal training, no institutional affiliation. What he had was an unbroken record of handling black mambas, gaboon vipers, and kraits without incident, and he treated that record the way gamblers treat winning streaks. That evening, he had invited Lily Hagen, 29, a woman from Tinder, to his garage, a controlled shock designed to impress. She said that he tapped the lid of the taipan's tub with his knuckle to make it move. Now, you wouldn't find me close to an inland taipan. It's the most venomously toxic land snake on Earth. A single bite delivers enough venom to kill over 100 adults. Its complex blend of neurotoxins, myotoxins, and procoagulants attacks the nervous system, muscle tissue, and blood's ability to clot simultaneously. The snake can strike and retract in under 0.15 seconds, far beyond the threshold of human reaction time. It normally avoids confrontation and would only bite defensively if threatened. When the lid shifted under his knuckle, the taipan struck through the gap before it had fully opened. The fangs connected with the inside of his right forearm, just below the wrist. The bite lasted under a second. Marcus pressed a shop rag against the 2 puncture marks, told Lily it was nothing. Now you wouldn't find me close to an inland taipan. It's the most venomously toxic land snake on Earth. A single bite delivers enough venom to be lethal, though fatalities are rare with prompt treatment. Now, here's what baffles me. Marcus said they were still going to dinner. Based on how proud he is of the specimen, he's likely aware that it's the most venomous snake in the world. I keep thinking to myself, why did he not seek help? Why brush it off, knowing you're risking dying? Lily watched the skin around the wound begin to redden slightly, and his color shift. Not dramatic, but enough. They drove to a chain restaurant on Federal Highway, Marcus at the wheel. By the time they sat at the table, 15 minutes after the bite, he was sweating through his shirt, and Lily said that his speech had a slight drag. He walked inside under his own power. Within 90 minutes, he began to feel generalized weakness in his arms and legs, a slight droop of the eyelids, and difficulty speaking clearly. A busboy later told investigators that Marcus appeared pale and was holding his arms stiffly, looking unwell. Over the next 10 minutes, his muscles began to tremble and his jaw stiffened. His body slowly lost coordination rather than locking violently. He sank down into the booth as his breathing became shallow and labored, with long pauses between breaths. His eyes were open, but unfocused, the whites showing at the lower rim. Lily was on her feet screaming. A server knelt beside the booth and gripped his shoulder to keep him from sliding to the floor. His arms gradually stopped moving, and his chest rose weakly with each breath. Restaurant staff called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Marcus had very weak vital signs, barely breathing and with a faint pulse. They worked him in the parking lot for 32 minutes before transport. He was pronounced dead at the hospital approximately 4 hours after the bite. Coroner's report listed the cause of death as acute envenomation, consistent with inland taipan. Wildlife officers found 23 snakes in total in his apartment, 11 of which were protected or prohibited under state and federal law. The taipan was alive and undisturbed in its locked tub inside the cabinet. It was transported to a licensed facility in Georgia. The garage was sealed pending federal review of the import chain. It was November 7th, 2013, and the Warawat market in Chiang Mai, Thailand was already dense with vendors by mid-morning, except in one corner of the reptile section, where a 19-year-old lay, motionless on the ground, while the surrounding crowd pressed inward, and nobody knew what to do. Somchai Fan grew up 4 blocks from that market. He had enrolled the previous year, pursuing a biology degree. His professors described him as bright but unfocused, someone who could recite snake taxonomy, but struggled to finish a lecture without pulling out his phone. He had built a modest following on Facebook, posting close-range animal photographs, monitor lizards from river embankments, tokay geckos from neighborhood walls, and twice, pythons he had pulled from drainage channels near the market. His classmates found it impressive. His parents had asked him repeatedly to stop. He had come to Warawat that Thursday, specifically to photograph a king cobra that a vendor named Prathan had received 2 days earlier, kept discreetly in a reinforced wooden snake box near the back of his stall. Somchai was not there to buy it. Apparently, he wanted a close-range shot with his smartphone, ideally with his own face in the frame. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes on Earth, capable of reaching 18 feet and weighing up to 20 pounds. A single bite can deliver a large volume of neurotoxic venom, sometimes several hundred milligrams, with effects depending on how much is injected. The venom dismantles the nervous system systematically, targeting the muscles that control breathing, and eventually the heart. It does not cause dramatic convulsions. It causes a progressive, measurable shutdown. Prathan had secured the snake box and posted a handwritten note in Thai on the front. Do not open. He had sold reptiles for 11 years and kept king cobras twice before, always with locked enclosures and thick gloves within reach. That morning, he had warned 2 other visitors away from the box before Somchai arrived, and had stepped only a few meters away to speak with another seller. When Somchai crouched near the box around 10:40 a.m. and lifted the lid slightly, Prathan told him directly in Thai to step back. Imagine that. He was already warned, potentially saving his life, yet he still continued. A vendor at the adjacent stall echoed the warning. Somchai raised his phone, adjusted his angle, and leaned directly over the opening, bringing his upper body within a foot or two of the rim. The cobra struck upward from inside the opening, fangs making clean contact with Somchai's chest, left of center, through his shirt. The force pushed him back onto his heels, but did not put him on the ground immediately. Prathan, standing 3 feet away, later told police that within the first minute, Somchai's expression shifted from focused to strained, his eyes blinking more slowly and his mouth tightening as if he were trying to speak but could not. Somchai remained upright for a moment before sitting down on the ground. Over the next several minutes, a faint trembling appeared in his hands. His eyelids began to droop and his head started to lose support at the neck, forcing him to tilt it slightly back. Prathan came around the counter and moved him away from the box, laying him flat in the shade of the adjacent canopy. Somchai's chest was still rising, but each breath was shorter than the one before it. By approximately 15 minutes, his eyes were open and struggling to stay focused. His mouth had gone slack. His fingers had slowed to minimal movement. A faint bluish tint began to appear around his lips as his breathing weakened. By 30 minutes, he was making only shallow, infrequent attempts to breathe. Bystanders attempted to tilt his head back to open his airway and fanned his face. One man poured water on his forehead. Another bystander tried to wrap cloth around his upper torso in an attempt to slow the spread of venom, though it had no effect. None of it addressed what was systematically happening inside him. Prathan called the emergency line at approximately 10:47 a.m. Responders arrived at 11:26, roughly 40 minutes. After the strike, Somchai was unresponsive, with no spontaneous respiration, despite basic airway support administered on scene. The coroner's summary noted cause of death as respiratory paralysis, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation. No significant wound laceration was found on external examination. The fangs had punctured cleanly and closed. Time of death was estimated between 11:10 and 11:30 a.m. Somchai's parents collected his belongings from the university the following week. I don't know what's more baffling, that Somchai ignored a handwritten warning, a verbal warning from the vendor, and another warning from a neighboring stall, all to lean his face and chest directly over an open snake box holding a king cobra for a selfie. It was July 15, 2016, along a rural highway in Trang Province, Thailand. Traffic had slowed under the afternoon heat because a large king cobra was stretched across the road. Niran Pechkul, 34, was known around nearby areas as someone who could deal with snakes. He worked as a motorcycle mechanic, but on the side, he helped remove snakes from homes and small properties. He didn't have formal training, but he had done it enough times that he trusted himself. Small bites and close calls didn't scare him anymore. They just became stories he told. To me, it feels like this is where things start to go wrong. When you've done something enough times that you stop thinking about what could actually happen. That afternoon, Niran was riding home when he saw the traffic. He moved between the stopped vehicles and saw the cobra lying across both lanes. It was large, thick, and already watching everything around it. Some people had stepped out of their cars. A few were filming. Others just stood there, unsure what to do. I've seen situations like this before. Once people stop and gather, it usually makes things worse. The snake had its head raised slightly, hood partly open, following movement. A truck driver nearby warned people to stay back. A few others agreed and said it was better to wait, but Niran stepped forward and said he could move it. Honestly, this feels like one of those moments where everything depends on a single choice, whether you step in or just leave it alone. He walked behind the snake, planning to grab it the way he had seen in videos. But as he got closer, the cobra turned toward him, its head lifted higher, body tensing. Watching videos makes it look easy. Real life isn't like that. Neron moved quickly and tried to grab the head, but his hand landed too far back. The cobra reacted instantly. It twisted and struck. The first bite hit his left forearm as he raised it. Neron pulled back immediately and lost his grip. The cobra recoiled. Hood flared wide, holding its ground. As he stumbled backward, his movement brought him close again. The snake struck a second time in quick succession, a defensive reaction rather than a pursuit. From what I know, once something goes wrong with a snake like this, the situation escalates fast. He managed to move a few steps, but something was already off. At first it was subtle. He looked unsteady. His movements slowed. When he tried to speak, his words didn't come out clearly. Then his breathing began to change, becoming shallow and strained. People around him didn't know what to do. Some shouted, others moved away. One person called for help. I don't think people freeze because they don't care. They just don't know how to react in a situation like this. Neron collapsed near the side of the road. The cobra lowered itself and moved away into the nearby vegetation. On the ground, his condition continued to deteriorate. He remained conscious for a short time, but he couldn't respond properly. His breathing grew weaker, each breath more labored than the last. Within around 15 minutes of the bite, it had become critically shallow. Emergency services arrived shortly after, finding him barely responsive and showing signs of severe neurotoxic envenomation. He was placed in an ambulance, but his condition deteriorated during transport. His breathing grew increasingly irregular as paralysis spread, and despite efforts to support his airway, he went into respiratory failure. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after arrival, approximately 40 minutes after the initial bite. The incident didn't get much attention. It was reported simply as a snake handling accident. People who knew him remembered him as someone who helped others, but also someone who got too comfortable doing something dangerous. I think that's what makes this hard. He wasn't trying to do something reckless. He just believed he could handle it. For me, this feels preventable. He didn't have to step in. People were already waiting, and help could have been called. I don't think he meant to take a big risk, but he still chose to. With something like a king cobra, there's almost no room for mistakes. Sometimes the safer move is just to leave it alone, even if you think you can handle it. It was April 11, 2014, in Hwange National Park, Zimbabwe. The harsh African sun beat down on the dry landscape, where a guided photography tour had stopped to photograph a herd of elephants near a waterhole. The group consisted of 6 photographers, each equipped with expensive camera gear and varying levels of attention to where they were placing their feet. Lucas Reinhardt was 42 years old. He worked as a wildlife photographer from Munich. His portfolio including published work in several European nature magazines. He had photographed wolves in Romania, bears in Finland, and eagles in Scotland. His trip to Hwange was meant to add African wildlife to his collection. The guide was a Zimbabwean ranger named Tendai. He had positioned the group on foot approximately 100 meters from the elephant herd, maintaining safe distance. The group was standing in tall grass near a fallen log. Tendai had given his standard warning about watching for snakes, particularly puff adders, which were common in the area and had a tendency to lie motionless in the grass or near logs where they were nearly impossible to see. He explained that puff adders were responsible for more snakebite deaths in Africa than any other species, that they did not move away when approached like other snakes, and that their venom caused massive tissue damage and could be fatal without immediate treatment. Lucas was absorbed in his photography, moving slowly through the grass to get different angles of the elephants. He stepped over a fallen log without looking down, his attention focused entirely on his camera's viewfinder. His foot came down directly next to a puff adder that had been lying motionless in the grass on the other side of the log, perfectly camouflaged and completely invisible. Puff adders are ambush predators that rely on camouflage and patience. They do not flee when approached. Instead, they remain motionless and rely on their cryptic coloration to avoid detection. When stepped on or near, they strike defensively with remarkable speed. Their venom is cytotoxic, causing massive tissue destruction, internal bleeding, and potentially fatal complications if untreated. They are thick-bodied snakes that can reach over 4 feet in length, and they possess long fangs capable of delivering a large venom dose deep into tissue. The puff adder struck Lucas's lower leg just above his boot, its fangs sinking deep into his calf muscle. Lucas shouted and jumped back. Tendai immediately identified the snake as a puff adder and radioed for emergency medical evacuation, while instructing Lucas to sit down, remain calm, and keep his leg immobilized. Lucas sat down heavily, his face already pale with shock. The bite site began swelling almost immediately. Within 5 minutes, Lucas's entire lower leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin tight and discolored. He was experiencing severe pain at the bite site, describing it as a burning sensation that radiated up his leg. Tendai kept Lucas's leg immobilized and kept him as still as possible, explaining that movement would spread the venom more quickly through his lymphatic system. A helicopter had been dispatched from the nearest medical facility, but Hwanghae was remote. The nearest hospital with anti-venom was in Bulawayo, over 200 kilometers away. The helicopter would take at least 90 minutes to arrive. Within 20 minutes, the swelling had spread above his knee, and Lucas was beginning to show signs of systemic envenomation. He was experiencing severe nausea and vomiting. His blood pressure was dropping, and he was becoming increasingly disoriented. The tissue at the bite site had begun to turn dark purple and black as the cytotoxic venom destroyed muscle and blood vessels. By 40 minutes post-bite, Lucas was in critical condition. The swelling had spread to his hip and lower abdomen. He was experiencing difficulty breathing. His blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. The venom was causing widespread tissue destruction and triggering a systemic inflammatory response. His kidneys were beginning to fail as destroyed muscle tissue released toxins into his bloodstream. The helicopter arrived 95 minutes after the bite. The paramedics immediately started IV fluids and attempted to stabilize Lucas for transport, but his condition was critical. His blood pressure was barely detectable, his breathing was labored, and he was unresponsive. He was loaded into the helicopter and flown toward Bulawayo, but his condition continued to deteriorate during the flight. Lucas went into cardiac arrest approximately 20 minutes into the flight, likely due to a combination of severe shock, electrolyte imbalances from kidney failure, and the systemic effects of the venom. The paramedics performed CPR and administered emergency medications, but they were unable to restore a stable rhythm. Lucas was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after the snakebite, before the helicopter reached the hospital. The cause of death was determined to be cardiovascular collapse secondary to severe puff adder envenomation, complicated by rhabdomyolysis, acute kidney failure, and hypovolemic shock from massive tissue destruction. The medical examiner noted that the remote location and delayed access to anti-venom had been contributing factors. Authorities issued a statement emphasizing that the incident, while tragic, was the result of Lucas's failure to watch where he was stepping, despite clear warnings from his guide. Tendai noted in his report that he had specifically warned the group about puff adders in the area and had instructed everyone to watch their footing carefully. The puff adder remained in the area and was not killed or relocated. Park officials noted that this was exactly why guides gave warnings about watching for snakes, and that the warnings were effective for the thousands of tourists who actually followed them. It was June 9, 2016, and the midday heat hung thick over the Kinabatangan River in Sabah, Malaysia, where the muddy water ran slow and dark between mangrove roots and tangled reeds. 9-year-old Arif Hamdan had slipped away from his father's rubber plantation for the third time that week, drawn to the riverbank. Arif was the youngest son of Ismail, a rubber tapper who worked the plantation inland from the river. The boy was known throughout the small kampong for his boundless energy and his habit of wandering into places he shouldn't. His older sisters often scolded him for disappearing into the forest or down to the water's edge, but Arif seemed incapable of staying still. His mother had died 2 years earlier during childbirth, leaving his father and sisters to manage him as best they could while maintaining their work schedule, tapping rubber trees before dawn each morning. That afternoon, Arif convinced 4 children, ages 7 to 10, to join him along a shallow stretch of riverbank less than 650 feet from the nearest house. No adults were present, though parents assumed supervision. The children often played there despite warnings, treating the swampy fringe as their own. Wading in the shallows, Arif reached for a floating stick, shorts soaked to the waist, laughing and calling to the others when the water ahead rippled unnaturally. Reticulated pythons are among the world's longest snakes, regularly exceeding 20 feet in length and weighing over 150 pounds. These non-venomous constrictors are ambush predators, capable of remaining motionless for hours in vegetation before striking with explosive speed. They kill by constriction, wrapping powerful coils around their prey and tightening with each exhale, causing rapid circulatory and cardiac collapse. The python had been coiled in the low-hanging branches of a submerged tree, its massive body draped across the wood in perfect camouflage. At over 18 feet long and weighing approximately 160 pounds, the snake had gone unnoticed by the children playing just feet away. When Arif stepped into its strike range, the python launched itself with terrifying speed. The attack came without warning. One moment, Arif was standing waist-deep in the river. The next, he was screaming as thick coils wrapped around his legs and lower torso. The python's muscular body contracted with crushing force, soon preventing him from drawing a full breath. Arif's screams brought the other children splashing toward him, But what they found paralyzed them with horror. The massive snake had already encircled most of Arif's small body, its coils overlapping in thick bands that applied extreme pressure to his chest and abdomen. Two of the older children grabbed Arif's hands and pulled with all their strength, screaming and crying, but they could not overcome the python's grip. Each time Arif exhaled, the coils tightened, incrementally, preventing his lungs from fully expanding on the next breath. His face turned red, then purple, his eyes bulging as he struggled for air. The python began pulling him deeper into the water, its body undulating as it adjusted its position. Arif's legs disappeared beneath the surface first, then his hips. The children were screaming now, some still pulling uselessly at his arms. One girl finally broke away and ran toward the houses, shrieking for help. By the time she reached the nearest adult, a plantation worker named Ahmad, Arif had slipped completely underwater. The python's coils submerged with him. Only a few bubbles broke the surface where he had been standing moments before. Ahmad sprinted to the river with a machete, joined quickly by 3 other men from the village. They waded into the murky water, following the traumatized pointing of the children who remained on the bank. One man stepped on something solid beneath the surface and shouted they had found the python. Working together, they hacked at the overlapping coils with machetes and forced them apart despite the risk of being struck, dragging the massive snake toward shore, its body still wrapped tight around Arif's limp form. It took 4 men nearly 10 minutes to pry the coils loose enough to extract the boy. They beheaded the snake. Siti's mother had called for emergency services from the kampung's only telephone, but the nearest medical facility was over 30 minutes away by road. By the time the ambulance arrived, Arif had been pulled from the water and laid on the muddy bank, his body motionless, and his skin already taking on the gray pallor of death. The medical examiner, who arrived the following day, determined that Arif had died from rapid cardiac and circulatory arrest due to constriction, with drowning as a secondary factor. His ribcage showed possible compression fractures, consistent with python constriction, and faint rows of bite marks were documented along his torso and arms, while his lungs were filled with river water. Arif's family held a quiet funeral, attended by the entire kampung. His father returned to work in the rubber plantation, rising before dawn as always. But neighbors noticed he no longer sang the traditional songs while tapping the trees. The stretch of riverbank where Arif died remained empty of playing children for years afterward. It was May 21st, 2016, and by 11 p.m., the São Paulo skyline burned cold through floor-to-ceiling glass, while inside penthouse 34 of a newly completed building in the Jardins district, 30 people raised their glasses without knowing that one of them had already run out of time. Ricardo Alves was 28, a junior architect at a boutique firm who had spent 4 years working 18-hour days to reach the point where he could afford a place like this. He had purchased the penthouse 6 months before the housewarming, renovating every surface himself, including the centerpiece, a floor-to-ceiling glass terrarium built into the living room wall, housing a specimen of the Brazilian jararaca. Brazilian jararaca is one of South America's most medically significant pit vipers, adults averaging 3 to 4 feet, carrying hemotoxic venom that attacks blood vessels and destroys tissue at the cellular level. Their heat-sensing pits track warm-blooded prey in total darkness. A single envenomation causes immediate sharp pain and swelling that spreads gradually over several hours, while systemic effects such as coagulopathy, hypotension, and kidney stress can develop progressively. Prompt antivenom is critical to prevent severe complications and even death. According to friends, the snake had come through a private dealer. Ricardo had apparently applied for a private keeper's license that kept being declined, something he dismissed when friends asked. I think that if your license application doesn't go through, that should have been a sign. The terrarium was impeccable, humidity controlled, UV lit, latched on all 4 panels. He treated it the same way he treated the exposed. Concrete ceiling and the reclaimed wood kitchen island. A design element. A controlled thing. The feeding slot latch had a known small clearance that required careful handling, and a heavy touch could move it. A guest named Tiago, visibly drunk by 10:40 p.m., had been photographing the terrarium on his phone for most of the evening. At some point, he leaned against the glass, and his elbow nudged the feeding slot. A poorly latched panel moved roughly 6 inches, exposing the inside. The snake moved immediately. Ricardo's girlfriend, Elena Marquez, saw it first. She crossed the room, grabbed his arm, and told him the door had shifted and the snake was at the opening. Ricardo pushed the slot toward closed, and in that moment, the jararaca struck his left calf. He pulled his leg back. He applied a loose wrap around the bite site while keeping his leg still. Now, I'm no expert, but even I know that's just a partial first aid understanding, because he apparently did not attempt. Constrictive pressure. Elena told him twice in the first 15 minutes to call emergency services, and for some unknown reason, both times he refused. His friends were speculating that either he didn't want to get in trouble with the authorities, or he just didn't want to ruin the fun. Still, the bite site had begun swelling noticeably. By 11:15 p.m., the swelling had moved above the knee. The skin showed early ecchymosis and slight blistering along the inner calf. Ricardo set down his glass when walking became difficult. Several guests had gone quiet. Someone near the kitchen noticed a faint discoloration under his sock, early bruising. He grabbed the railing near the stairs and held on. His breathing had slowed to something deliberate and labored. By 11:45 p.m., he had collapsed twice. The second time, two guests held him upright by the arms while he clutched his leg with both hands. A guest who identified herself as a nursing student checked his pulse manually and found it weak and irregular. The skin below his knee was firm and discolored. She told the people around her to get him on the floor and keep him still. Elena called emergency services at 11:22 p.m., approximately 42 minutes after the bite. Ricardo could no longer stand unassisted. He was on the floor near the kitchen island, his back against the cabinetry, when systemic symptoms began to show: pallor, sweating, and shallow breathing as venom effects progressed. By 12:30 a.m., he was semi-conscious with worsening tissue damage and signs of internal bleeding. When paramedics arrived, Ricardo was barely conscious and his blood pressure critically low. Anti-venom had still not been administered at the scene due to his deteriorating condition and delayed recognition of severity. He succumbed later at the hospital from complications including severe tissue necrosis and internal bleeding. The cause of death was complications of hemotoxic envenomation, including severe tissue damage and internal bleeding, compounded by coagulopathy and subsequent circulatory collapse. Environmental authorities seized the Chararaca within hours and transferred it to a herpetological research facility outside the city. 14 of the 30 guests gave formal statements to civil police. 3 sought follow-up mental health support in the weeks that followed. Ricardo's firm issued a brief statement and declined further comment. I really think this was a completely preventable tragedy, caused by Ricardo's stubbornness and overconfidence, ignoring warnings and treating a deadly snake like a decorative object. Even his refusal to call for help immediately turned a manageable bite into a fatal outcome. It was May 14th, 2013, and by mid-morning, the air in the Kochi outskirts was already thick and wet. Somewhere inside a single-story home on the edge of a quiet residential lane, a man was preparing to do something his neighbors had watched him do a dozen times before. Rajesh Menon, 42, had spent the better part of 2 decades working with snakes. He sourced them, bred them, and sold them to private collectors and the occasional research contact. He was not formally trained, no herpetology degree, no institutional affiliation, but he had handled enough animals to carry himself with the confidence of someone who believed experience was indistinguishable from expertise. I do think overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer, and this man will prove it. He was well known on his lane, the kind of man who attracted small crowds when he opened the terrariums in his back room. Neighbors recalled him as loud and good-humored, someone who liked an audience. His prized possession was a king cobra he had kept for roughly 3 years, nearly 12 feet long, which he referred to by a nickname and claimed had never given him serious trouble. He had told people this often enough that he had begun to believe it absolutely. The lane where Rajesh lived ran alongside a narrow canal choked with water hyacinth, and on the morning of the 14th, the air smelled of mud and something faintly floral. He had invited 2 neighbors over, a retired schoolteacher and the man who ran a small provision shop nearby, to see the cobra before a potential buyer came to look at it that afternoon. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes on Earth, capable of reaching over 18 feet and weighing more than 20 pounds. A single envenomation can deliver a large volume of venom, sometimes several hundred milligrams depending on the bite, capable of causing rapid and severe neurotoxic effects in humans. The schoolteacher later told investigators that Rajesh had said the snake was used to his presence, that it would not react. He lifted the lid and reached in barehanded, gripping the animal just behind the jaw as he had done before. For a moment, the cobra was still, then it coiled. The neighbors both stepped back. The strike happened twice, in fast succession, before either man fully registered the first. The cobra's fangs connected near Rajesh's right forearm and again closer to the wrist. He did not drop the snake immediately. He stood holding it for several seconds, his expression difficult to read, before he set it back into the terrarium and closed the lid. The neighbor said he was calm at first. He sat down on the veranda steps, flexing his hand, saying it was fine. I have relatives like this. People who think being flustered and panicking damaged their ego, but none of them ended up this badly. Neither of the witnesses attempted any first aid, and there was a brief period of hesitation as they tried to decide what to do. Rajesh just waved them off and put back the cobra like nothing happened. He then invited them inside their house for chit-chat. Within 10 minutes, his speech had begun to thicken. By the 20-minute mark, his words were no longer fully intelligible. His eyelids had begun to droop, and his grip strength was visibly weakening, and he was having difficulty controlling his head. The schoolteacher described him leaning against the veranda post, trying to stand, then sliding sideways. His breathing was audible, slow, labored, with long pauses between inhales that grew progressively longer. There was no thrashing, no seizure. The deterioration was quiet and steady in a way both witnesses found more disturbing than violence would have been. His lips were darkening. The venom was dismantling his respiratory musculature with mechanical precision. The teacher called the local government hospital at approximately the 20-minute mark. The ambulance arrived about 30 minutes after that call. By then, Rajesh was supine on the veranda floor, unresponsive, showing progressive paralysis, still breathing weakly in shallow, irregular pulls. Paramedics attempted resuscitation. He was transported but showed no meaningful response during transit and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The cobra was found inside the closed terrarium when wildlife officers arrived later that afternoon. The post-mortem examination confirmed full neurotoxic envenomation. The report noted bilateral fang punctures on the right forearm consistent with a defensive strike pattern, significant venom absorption, and complete respiratory paralysis as the cause of death. Rajesh's family cremated him within 2 days. I can't help but think this was a death entirely of his own making. A man so drunk on his own hype, so desperate to play the fearless expert for a pair of captive neighbors, that he barehanded a 12-foot neurotoxic missile and then waved off help like he'd stubbed a toe. It was March 28, 2015, in a cocoa plantation in the eastern region of Ghana, where thick vegetation covered the ground after days of heavy rain. The narrow paths between plots were muddy, and visibility near the ground was poor. The ground looks almost the same everywhere. Wet leaves, dark soil, nothing really stands out. Kojo Mensah, 42, worked seasonally on the plantation. He was known for being efficient, often moving faster than others, by cutting through areas most workers avoided. He had done the job long enough to feel comfortable navigating dense brush, even when others stuck to the cleared paths. You can picture him moving ahead of the others, not really slowing down, just focused on getting through. That week, supervisors had warned workers to stay on marked paths. The rain had pushed animals, including snakes, into thicker ground cover. Most workers followed the advice, but Kojo continued using a shortcut he had taken many times before. Late in the morning, he moved between plots, stepping through leaf litter and low brush. The ground was uneven, softened by rain, and covered in fallen leaves. Visibility was limited to just a few feet ahead. Everything is quiet except for footsteps and the sound of leaves shifting under him. He stepped forward. His foot came down directly onto a camouflaged gaboon viper. The snake struck immediately. Kojo jerked back, more surprised than anything at first. For a brief moment, it wasn't clear what had happened. Then, the pain hit, sharp and immediate. He tried to steady himself, but the intensity forced him to stop moving. The reaction is quick, more instinct than understanding at that point. Within moments, swelling began around his ankle. The area around the bite changed quickly, and he struggled to put weight on it. He called out, and nearby workers rushed over. They found him sitting on the ground, trying to stay upright. The swelling was already spreading and bleeding from the wound hadn't stopped. You can imagine them looking down, trying to figure out what exactly they're dealing with. Co-workers tried to help him stand, but he couldn't support himself. They decided to carry him out of the brush toward the nearest access road. One of them ran ahead to alert the supervisor. As they moved him, his condition started to change. He became weaker, less responsive. His grip loosened when they tried to support him. He spoke less, and when he did, it was unclear. The movement gets slower, more careful, like they're trying not to make things worse. They tried to keep his legs still, but the uneven ground made it difficult, and the walk to the main road felt longer than usual. A vehicle was arranged quickly, but the 40-minute ride to the clinic proved critical. During transport, his condition worsened. Swelling spread up his leg, bleeding continued, and the venom disrupted clotting, causing internal bleeding and a sharp drop in blood pressure, reducing oxygen to his organs. By the time they arrived, he was in critical condition with hypovolemic shock and systemic envenomation. Despite anti-venom and fluids, his condition worsened with ongoing tissue damage, internal bleeding, and falling blood pressure. Over the next few hours, he developed organ failure and later died from massive hemotoxic effects due to circulatory collapse and uncontrolled internal bleeding. The incident didn't spread far beyond the plantation. It was recorded internally and briefly noted in local reports, but it didn't gain wider attention. Among workers, though, it changed how people moved through the fields. After something like that, the same paths don't feel the same anymore. In the following weeks, supervisors reinforced rules about staying on cleared paths. Workers who once took shortcuts began avoiding dense brush altogether. Kojo was remembered as someone hardworking and experienced, someone who knew the land well. It's the kind of place where people just go back to work the next day, but a little more careful than before. Looking at the situation, I think it could have been avoided. The safer path was already there, and the conditions that day made things riskier than usual. I don't think he expected anything to happen. It probably felt like any other day, but in places like that, one step in the wrong spot is all it takes. It was March 15, 2017, and the heavy pre-monsoon heat settled over the kampong houses outside Temerloh. The night air was still, and beyond the wooden walls, a large animal moved quietly through the brush, drawn by the presence of small prey and nearby human activity. Faisal bin Osman, 28, had moved into the small wooden house 2 years earlier after his workshop closed. Quiet and slight, he spent his days repairing bikes in a shed beside the house and lived mostly alone, calling his parents only once a month. The modest 1980s home had thin wooden walls, a simple layout, and small gaps beneath the doors and along the base, common in the area, but not always secure against wildlife. Unbeknownst to him, a large reticulated python had been frequenting the area, feeding on rodents and poultry around nearby homes. Over the months, warning signs had quietly accumulated. Faisal often heard rustling and scraping sounds outside at night, sometimes close to the walls. When he mentioned it to a neighbor, he brushed it off as stray animals or monitor lizards. A faint track in the dirt near his doorway appeared one morning, but went unnoticed. By February, a musky odor had begun to linger near the back of the house. Faisal assumed it came from damp wood or a dead animal nearby and tried to ignore it. Looking back, I can't help but feel how easy it is to normalize things in our own space. Little warning signs blend into everyday life until they're no longer just small annoyances. In the days before the incident, neighbors reported seeing a large snake moving near the edge of the settlement, likely following rodents and chickens. The pre-monsoon heat and limited prey pushed it closer to human structures. That night, Faisal lay on his thin mattress on the floor, the wooden door shut but not fully sealed, leaving a gap. Into the night, the python entered through that gap. I can't even imagine how quiet that moment must have been. No warning, no sound, just something massive already inside the room. Faisal was asleep when the snake moved across the floor and made contact. He woke suddenly, confused, and tried to pull away, but the python struck and anchored onto his upper arm and shoulder area. Almost instantly, its body snapped into coils around him. Faisal struggled instinctively, pushing against the dense, muscular coils, but the snake tightened with controlled, steady force. Its coils wrapped rapidly around his chest, torso, and legs, pinning his arm against his ribs almost immediately. The pressure compressed his chest and major blood vessels, disrupting circulation almost immediately. He managed one full panicked scream, followed by shorter, strained cries that echoed in the small room. Panic surged as he realized he couldn't free himself. The python tightened rapidly, locking its coils in place and applying crushing pressure within seconds. I can't picture the panic he must have felt. 1 second he's asleep, the next he's completely trapped, with no space and no way out. Within seconds, his movements weakened as circulation was disrupted. His vision blurred, and he lost consciousness soon after as his blood pressure collapsed under the sustained constriction. Even after he was still, the python remained coiled tightly, instinctively maintaining its hold. Its body stayed wrapped around him, unmoving except for subtle tightening, acting purely on instinct rather than intent. His neighbor, Enchik Hafiz, was awakened by the distant screams. He instructed his wife to stay inside, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously approached Faisal's house, his pace slowing as the silence returned. Finding no response at the door, he stepped inside and immediately saw the scene: the disturbed room and the massive python coiled tightly around Faisal's motionless body. Shaken, he backed out and called emergency services. When responders arrived, they faced the difficult task of safely restraining and uncoiling the snake, which took over 20 minutes. Faisal was pronounced dead at the scene, and the python was captured and relocated to a nearby wildlife reserve. His devastated parents traveled from Terengganu for the funeral, attended by 25 family members. The house remained vacant for over a year before it was eventually demolished, a quiet reminder of what had happened inside. Reading this, it hits me how fragile our sense of safety can be. It was a quiet, ordinary night, and in just a few minutes, everything changed. The gaps in the house, the nearby wildlife, the ignored signs, they all built into a moment where there was no way out. It's a reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn dangerous when small risks are overlooked. It was April 18, 2018, in the dense rainforest near Santarém, where the morning humidity hung so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The sun struggled to penetrate the layered canopy overhead, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Rodrigo Carvalho was a 35-year-old subsistence hunter from a small village on the outskirts of Santarém. Unlike the younger men who had left for city work, Rodrigo had stayed, carving out a reputation as one of the most skilled trackers in the region. He could identify animal trails invisible to others and move through the understory with minimal sound. His family relied on the bushmeat he brought back: peccary, capybara, occasionally tapir, and he supplemented their income by selling excess game to neighboring villages. But Rodrigo's expertise had bred a dangerous sense of invulnerability, particularly when it came to snakes. Rodrigo had encountered dozens of venomous snakes over the years: furred de lances on riverbanks, coral snakes in leaf litter, even a juvenile bushmaster he killed with his machete. He often handled dead snakes for photos, despite his wife's warnings, confident he could distinguish threat from trophy. That morning, he set out with two companions, Marcos and Tiago, along a 6-mile hunting trail into primary forest. The path was overgrown, littered with branches and thick vines, and decomposing leaves muffled their footsteps. Bushmasters are the largest pit vipers in the Americas, reaching lengths of up to 10 feet and weighing over 15 pounds. Their hemotoxic venom attacks blood cells and vessel walls, causing massive internal hemorrhaging, tissue necrosis, and shock. These snakes are so motionless when hunting that they can be mistaken for dead, their cryptic brown and black patterns blending perfectly with the forest floor. They can remain completely still for hours, even days, waiting for prey to come within striking distance. Around 10:30 a.m., the group moved through ferns and rotting logs when Marcos stopped, pointing to a massive bushmaster coiled near fallen branches. Thick as a forearm and about 7 feet long, it appeared still. Rodrigo crouched, misreading the faint coil movement as death, and declared it dead. Tiago warned about bushmasters, but Rodrigo, likely eager to prove its size to his father-in-law, grabbed it behind what he thought was its head. The bushmaster struck with explosive speed. In an instant, it whipped its head around and buried its 2-inch fangs deep into Rodrigo's right forearm, just below the elbow. It bit and held briefly before releasing, and Rodrigo flung it away in shock. The bushmaster landed several feet away and disappeared into the undergrowth with surprising quickness. Rodrigo stared at the 2 puncture wounds, blood already streaming down his arm, his expression shifting from surprise to dawning horror. Marcos immediately pulled off his shirt and wrapped it tightly above the bite to slow the spread of venom, while Tiago tried to radio the nearest ranger station on a handheld unit they carried for emergencies. The signal was weak this deep in the forest, but after several attempts, he made contact, reporting the emergency and their approximate location. The rangers estimated they were at least 2 hours from the nearest road where a vehicle could meet them. Within 15 minutes, Rodrigo began showing severe symptoms. His arm had swollen grotesquely, the tissue turning dark purple and black as venom destroyed blood vessels and muscle tissue. He complained of intense pain radiating up his shoulder and into his chest. His breathing became labored, and he began sweating profusely despite the forest's shade. Marcos and Tiago tried to help him walk, then stopped and kept his arm immobilized when he struggled to stay upright. He vomited violently, the contents streaked with blood. a sign of internal hemorrhaging. The two men constructed a crude stretcher from saplings and Marcos's jacket, lifting Rodrigo onto it and beginning the agonizing journey back toward the trailhead. Rodrigo drifted in and out of consciousness, his blood pressure dropping rapidly as the venom's hemotoxic effects cascaded through his system. Blood seeped from his nose and the corners of his mouth. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular. After nearly 2 hours of carrying him, Rodrigo stopped breathing around 12:45 p.m. Marcos attempted chest compressions, while Tiago continued toward the rendezvous point, but it was futile. Only anti-venom and advanced hospital care could have addressed the damage already unfolding inside his body. When they finally reached the road about 2 hours and 40 minutes after the bite, Rodrigo Carvalho had been dead for less than half an hour. A ranger named Costa filed the official incident report with state authorities, noting that the victim had been bitten by a bushmaster after deliberately handling what he believed was a dead specimen. The time of death was estimated at approximately 12:45 p.m., just over 2 hours after the initial bite. Rodrigo's funeral was attended by the entire village, where several elders used his death as a reminder of the rainforest's unforgiving nature. The bushmaster responsible was never located, having vanished into the millions of acres of dense forest that stretched endlessly in all directions. It was February 2nd, 2018, at Whitmore Station in far north Queensland, and the wet season heat had already broken 85 degrees before 7 in the morning when the sequence of decisions began that would leave paramedics focusing on the wrong thing. Bartholomew Bart Whitmore, 60, had operated the family cattle station in the Cardwell Shire for 31 years following his father's death. He was regarded in the local agricultural community as capable and direct, but also as someone who pushed seasonal workers hard and dismissed concerns from those he considered below his authority. The station ran lean and cycled through more casual labor than most comparable operations in the region. Based on what I've read, people said that he had a reputation not for cruelty, but for a total intolerance of what he called unnecessary hesitation. But I think they're just sugarcoating it. That morning, he had put a young backpacker named Jack to work clearing tall Mitchell grass along the eastern fence line, an area with dense patches of Mitchell grass, scrub, and rodent burrows known to attract taipans. Jack had no protective gear and no bush experience. After 40 minutes, he walked back to Bart and reported definite coastal taipan signs in the area: shed skins, disturbed rodent burrows near fence posts, and partially hidden flattened grass patches, suggesting a snake had passed. He left the property shortly after. Simon Drew, a farmhand from the neighboring station, watched the exchange from across the boundary fence. The coastal taipan is one of the most venomous snakes in the world. Adults in far north Queensland commonly exceed 6 feet, with some over 7. Its presynaptic neurotoxin disrupts nerve-to-muscle communication, causing paralysis that becomes irreversible past a threshold. Severe bites can lead to respiratory failure in 30 to 90 minutes without antivenom. Strikes are fast, and the snake usually withdraws immediately, leaving only a sharp sting with no early warning of the venom's effect. Before Bart entered the grass, Simon called across and relayed what Jack had told him. Bart did not respond. He walked into the Mitchell grass, swinging the machete in low lateral arcs at knee height, precisely the opposite of the careful, high-stepping approach that anyone experienced in taipan country would use by instinct. Simon watched for a short time, then returned to his own work. The report said that he likely stepped on it. The post-mortem placed the bite on Bart's lower right calf, 2 puncture marks, 3/4 of an inch apart, consistent with a large adult taipan. The snake had likely struck and immediately withdrawn. Simon did not see the bite. What he saw minutes later was Bart walking quickly back toward the equipment shed, cursing audibly, moving with visible agitation. Bart apparently climbed into his truck and drove off down the internal station road. Simon assumed he had cut himself on the blade. He did not follow. The neurotoxins were already crossing into his neuromuscular junctions, silently dismantling the acetylcholine, signaling that kept his muscles responding to his brain's commands. In taipan envenomation, fine motor control deteriorates before gross motor function. Fingers first, then grip, then larger coordinated movement. His foot would have grown heavy on the accelerator, and steering increasingly awkward. Loss of coordination and mild slurred speech would have started within 15 to 20 minutes after the bite, with severe weakness by 30 minutes. According to eyewitnesses, the truck drifted from the internal road at under 20 miles per hour and struck a timber utility pole on the eastern boundary. The engine kept running. By the time the truck stopped, Bart was incapable of purposeful movement. Respiratory muscles were failing rapidly, but a few shallow breaths were still possible. Presynaptic neurotoxins, once they have disrupted the nerve terminals past a structural threshold, do not respond to antivenom. His chest muscles were failing. Each breath was likely shallower than the one before it. He slumped forward against the wheel. Maria Parada, a contract laborer driving toward the station on the adjacent access road, heard the collision and found Bart slumped against the wheel, minimally responsive. She called emergency services at 8:43 a.m. Paramedics arrived in 15 minutes and initially assessed him for crash injuries, suspected head trauma, possible chest impact. The bite on his calf was not identified until he was being moved for transport. I feel bad for the responders because they were faced with the problem they were not prepared for. They likely did things correctly, by the book, and yet they were missing the killer. The neurotoxin progression was already at a point generally considered irreversible for presynaptic paralysis. He was declared dead at 9:31 a.m. Post-mortem findings. Primary cause of death: envenomation by Oxyuranus scutellatus, coastal taipan. Secondary finding: blunt force trauma consistent with vehicle collision. The cattle station itself was sold several months later. They changed ownership, and the new proprietors opted to restructure operations entirely. The seasonal and casual workers who had been employed under Bart were laid off, leaving many without immediate employment or housing arrangement. As much as Bart was to blame in the story, he still provided jobs for multiple people. I just wish he was kinder to them. Then maybe I'd feel bad for his demise. It was August 3rd, 2014, and the dry heat of the Limpopo bush pressed over the Olifants River corridor with a weight that makes the ground feel closer than it should. The kind of afternoon that ends badly for people who confuse stillness with safety. Thomas van Rensburg was 28, a mechanic from Sanin who spent his weekends filming reptiles in the scrubland bordering Kruger National Park, where he lived in a rural cabin and had spent enough time outdoors to believe he understood what lived there. Based on what I've read, he was not a trained handler or a herpetologist. He owned 2 hard drives of wildlife footage, monitor lizards, puff adders, whatever moved, shared between friends, and never sold. His reputation among the group he hiked with was of someone who pushed past the point others stopped at. He had survived enough close calls that risk had become habit rather than warning. He had spent weeks planning this particular stretch for its rocky riverbed outcroppings, where snakes concentrated during the dry season. His 3 companions, Luan, Kobus, and Danny, had made trips with him before and understood his pattern. The campsite sat in dry Mopane scrub above a sand-bottomed bend of the Olifants, the terrain all flat rock and dead grass. The black mamba is among the fastest land snakes on the continent, capable of roughly 10 to 12 miles per hour in short bursts. Its venom is almost entirely neurotoxic. Without antivenom, a single bite can kill an adult human within hours, and when provoked, the mamba does not strike once. They found the snake near a granite shelf at late afternoon. It had already raised the front third of its body off the ground, mouth slightly parted, the black interior clearly visible. As Thomas stepped closer, the snake shifted laterally along the rock, angling away as if to escape before stopping and turning back toward him. Luan told Thomas they should back away. Kobus agreed. Thomas picked up a branch from the ground and said he only wanted footage of it moving. His camera was already recording from where he had set it down moments earlier, angled toward the rock. The snake held its position. He prodded it once. It contracted sharply and turned. He prodded it again. The first strike came before anyone registered movement. A dry, flat impact against skin, followed by Thomas jerking his left forearm to his chest. The snake surged forward in a rapid sequence of strikes, 2 landing cleanly on the same forearm within seconds, while others glanced off as he recoiled. Thomas sat back and came down hard on the granite. His friends moved toward him immediately. 2 puncture sites were visible on the inner forearm, already welling and darkening at the margins. They pulled out their phones. No signal among the 4 of them. The nearest ranger station was a multi-hour hike in daylight. The light was already going. During their hike, the neurotoxin moved through him in sequence. Peripheral sensory disruption first, then progressive motor failure, then the respiratory muscles. His breathing became audible, a shallow mechanical pull against a chest that was no longer responding correctly. His fingers moved involuntarily along the sleeping pad beneath him. When Kobus spoke directly to him, Thomas opened his mouth and produced only a whisper, the muscles of his face already losing precision. Luan wrapped a cloth tightly above the bite and they tried to keep his arm still against his body, speaking to him to keep him responsive as long as possible. They assembled a stretcher from 2 hiking poles lashed to sleeping pads with paracord, moving as quickly as 4 people in shock could manage. They were carrying him within 12 minutes of the second bite. The terrain was uneven and broken, the trail barely visible once the last light left. They rotated at the poles every few hundred meters. They lost the trail twice and had to backtrack. Thomas was fully unresponsive by the second hour, his breathing reduced to something barely audible. Somewhere during the third hour, carrying him down a dry riverbed in the dark, his chest stopped moving. They did not stop walking. They reached a gravel road after roughly 4 hours and flagged down a passing farm vehicle. A ranger arrived at approximately 11:40 p.m. Thomas was already dead. No anti-venom had been administered at any point. The field coroner's report noted 2 puncture wounds on the left forearm consistent with large elapid envenomation, no evidence of treatment administered, and cause of death as acute respiratory failure due to neurotoxic envenomation. Honestly, I don't feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for Luan, Cobus, and Danny, who had to watch a grown man's ego write a check his respiratory system couldn't cash. Thomas Van Rensburg didn't die because the Mamba was fast. He died because he was too stupid to stop poking it. It was September 23rd, 2017, and the narrow strip of overgrown land along a drainage canal on the outskirts of Davao region was quiet, humid, and crawling with hidden dangers. Tall grass and dense shrubs had grown unchecked, and the area was known for occasional sightings of large snakes. Elian Vargo, 19, was searching for his missing dog, Bruno. He was the responsible one in his family, working part-time at a local electronics shop while helping care for his elderly grandmother. Bruno had been wandering near the canal since morning, and Elian didn't want to wait until dark. I can picture him moving through the grass, calling out for his dog, thinking it'll be a routine search. That area isn't as safe as it looks. The vegetation was thick and uneven, with hidden roots and holes making every step uncertain. Local warnings about large snakes had been ignored, and signs of recent movement in the grass were easy to miss. Even from the edge, it would have been difficult to spot anything lying still beneath the cover. Elian pushed forward, calling Bruno's name, unaware of the reticulated python coiled under the grass just a few feet away. Around 15 feet long, it struck instantly, biting his left thigh as it attempted to coil around his lower body in uneven partial wraps. He fell backward into the dense vegetation as the python tightened. The grass and branches scratched his arms and face, but the crushing pressure around his torso stole his focus. Every struggle only gave the snake more leverage. The coils shifted and tightened, restricting his movement further rather than forming a stable lock. The uneven ground made footing impossible, and every stumble let the coils squeeze harder. His chest felt trapped in a vice. His legs burned as circulation slowed, and each shallow gasp reminded him that fighting back only worsened the grip. I can't imagine that panic, knowing every move just makes it worse, knowing there's nothing you can do. Within minutes, Elian couldn't breathe properly. His chest was compressed, lungs unable to expand, and the coils on his legs cut off circulation. Each attempt to call for help produced only weak gasps. I would have been panicking so hard at this point, trying to shout, trying to move, feeling the air get pulled out of my lungs. The struggle was chaotic and uneven, with the python adjusting its coils as he fought to break free. His breathing became increasingly restricted, and his movements weakened over time. After several minutes of mounting pressure, he lost consciousness. It's terrifying to think about the time stretching out like that, helpless, with something so strong around you. By nightfall, when Elian didn't return, his family searched with flashlights. His uncle found him about 2 hours after the attack, still partially entangled in the vegetation where the attack happened. Emergency services arrived 25 minutes later, but the snake had already retreated. I can't imagine the shock of seeing him like that, knowing it was too late. The coroner confirmed rib fractures from severe constriction and asphyxiation, consistent with a reticulated python attack. He was believed to have lost consciousness from prolonged compression and later died from respiratory failure, caused by the injuries. Bruno's remains were found nearby days later, suggesting he may have been the first victim. It's heartbreaking to realize the dog led him right into danger without anyone noticing. After the incident, local officials posted additional warnings and increased patrols, but little else changed. Elian's family moved away within 6 months, unable to face the memories. Looking back, I feel like this could have been avoided. He didn't know he was in real danger. The area seemed quiet, familiar, but one wrong step in the wrong place, and it became fatal. I don't blame him. He just had no idea what was waiting there. It was August 7, 2014, in the northern section of Kruger National Park, deep in the Mopane Woodland Corridor, approximately 11 miles from the nearest camp facility. The winter dry season had pulled the color out of everything. Pale grass, gray bark, a sky that was clear and cold at first light. Rob Calder was 47 years old. A high school biology teacher, he had spent the better part of his career teaching students about ecosystems he had never actually walked through. The guided wilderness trail was something he had been planning for 2 years. A 3-day walk through the northern Mopane section. Small group, registered Parks Trails Guide. The group had departed at 5:45 a.m. before full light, using headlamps for the first hour. The pre-departure briefing had been thorough: animal awareness, emergency procedures, and trail-specific hazards. One was explicitly flagged: puff adder activity in the Mopane scrub sections during early morning hours, when the snakes move onto the trail surface to absorb ground heat. The risk window was highest between 6 and 8:30 a.m. Deliberate foot placement in narrow scrub sections was emphasized. At approximately 6:45 a.m., the Trails Guide moved ahead by roughly 80 feet to assess a washed-out section of trail, leaving the group stationary. The Mopane scrub pressed in on both sides. Narrow, low, the trail surface a mix of packed sand and dry leaf litter. A bird in a low branch caught Rob's attention. He stepped approximately 2 feet off the trail to get a better look. 2 feet, that is genuinely all it took. The puff adder is responsible for more snakebite fatalities in Africa than any other species. Not because its venom is the most toxic, but because of what it does over time. Adults measure between 3 and 4 feet and rely entirely on camouflage. Their chevron patterning, making them functionally invisible against dry leaf litter and packed sand. They do not move when approached. The strike is among the fastest of any viper, triggered when something comes within inches of the body. The venom is cytotoxic, destroying tissue at the cellular level, driving progressive swelling, and in severe cases, systemic organ involvement. The early stages are deceptive. The victim remains functional. The full picture of what has been delivered, not becoming visible for hours. A large adult puff adder in remote terrain is not an immediate emergency. It is a slow one, and slow emergencies are the hardest kind to survive. Rob stepped 2 feet off a trail in a section that had been specifically flagged in the briefing that morning. He had written it down. At approximately 6:52 a.m., his right boot came down within striking distance of a puff adder lying motionless in the leaf litter. The snake struck his right ankle above the boot line in a single movement. 2 puncture marks were visible. He called out to the group, and the Trails Guide was back within minutes. Swelling at the bite site was already visible. The guide activated his emergency communicator, transmitted a distress signal with GPS coordinates, and kept Rob still and seated. Movement accelerates venom absorption, and pressure immobilization was correctly avoided, as it is contraindicated for cytotoxic envenomation. Rob remained conscious and communicating. The swelling climbed steadily, ankle to lower calf, within the first hour, continuing upward through the morning. His responses became shorter and slower with each check, not dramatically, consistently. Watching someone fade that slowly, while you can do nothing but sit there and wait for help, that is its own kind of awful. The response team was dispatched within the hour, but the nearest vehicle access point was 6.2 miles out, and the terrain in the northern Mopane corridor does not permit direct vehicle access along the trail. The walking time from that point added roughly 2.5 hours. The team reached the group 4 hours after the signal was sent. Rob was airlifted to a hospital in Phalaborwa, and anti-venom was administered on arrival. He died 3 days later. The 4-hour delay had allowed tissue destruction and secondary complications, compartment syndrome followed by infection, to progress beyond what treatment could reverse. It was not a fast death. It was the kind the puff adder almost always produces when the conditions are right. Incremental, and by the time the full picture is visible, already very difficult to stop. The Trails Office reviewed its emergency response logistics following the incident. A recommendation was added to the northern Mopane Trail, briefing advising groups to avoid the narrow scrub sections entirely until after 8:30 a.m. during winter months. The briefing Rob had attended that morning already contained a version of that warning. He had written it down in the notes he carried with him on the trail, notes that were recovered with the rest of his kit when the response team reached the group. He wrote the warning down and still stepped off the trail. I do not think that makes him careless. I think it just makes him human. It was September 5th, 2013, in the mountainous village of Ban Rak Thai, Thailand, where morning fog clung to the tea plantations that blanketed the hillside like a shroud. The air hung thick with moisture as Chati Lertwong made his way toward the bamboo grove at the edge of his property, machete in hand, unaware that he would never return from this routine task. Chati was a 42-year-old farmer who had worked the same plot of land for nearly 2 decades, known throughout the village for his meticulous care of his tea plants and his stubborn independence. His neighbors respected his work ethic, but worried about his impatience when dealing with the wildlife that frequently encroached on cultivated areas. Chati insisted on handling problems himself, a habit born from years of successfully dispatching smaller pests. That morning, Chati discovered damaged bamboo shoots near his property line, likely from foraging animals, and decided to clear the undergrowth himself. He told his wife he would be back within the hour, aiming to finish before the midday heat. Confident from years of handling his land without incident, he pushed through the dense vegetation along the forest edge. Morning mist reduced visibility to just a few yards, masking the presence of a king cobra. These snakes, the world's longest venomous species, regularly reach 13 to 18 feet and generally avoid humans, but they can strike defensively if startled at close range. A single bite can deliver enough venom to cause rapidly progressive paralysis and death in an untreated person. Neighbors had warned Chati about increased cobra activity near the bamboo grove. Elderly farmer Prasert had seen a large king cobra 3 days earlier and urged caution, and the village headman offered to send a professional handler. But Chati dismissed all warnings, insisting he knew his land and couldn't leave damaged crops. That morning, Chati entered the clearing with his machete. Leaves and twigs crackled underfoot, masking other movements. About 10 feet away, a triangular head slowly rose through the mist. The unusually large king cobra, over 15 feet, spread its hood as Chati approached, likely triggered by his presence in its path. When Chati's machete came down on a bamboo stalk near the cobra's position, the snake interpreted it as a direct threat. It struck without prolonged warning, launching forward with shocking speed. A neighboring farmer saw Chati turned at the sound of movement and instinctively swung his machete at the approaching serpent. The blade missed, and the cobra's first strike connected with his right wrist, its fangs sinking deep into flesh. The pain must have been immediate and intense, like hot needles driven into bone. Chati jerked his arm back, but the cobra wasn't finished. Before he could retreat, it struck again, which is considered uncommon, but is documented, this time catching his forearm just below the elbow. The fangs pumped venom directly into muscle tissue, delivering a dose that would prove catastrophic. Chati stumbled backward, dropping his machete as he clutched his arm. The puncture wounds were clearly visible, already beginning to swell. The neighboring farmer looked up to see him staggering out of the bamboo grove. He immediately recognized the telltale signs of a snakebite and began running toward the village while shouting for help. Chati tried to walk toward the village clinic, approximately half a mile away, insisting he could make it on his own, despite the others urging him to stay still. The neurotoxin spread rapidly through his bloodstream. Within 15 minutes, pain radiated from his arm to his shoulder and neck. His speech became slurred when he tried to call out for help. His vision blurred and coordination failed. The muscles in his bitten arm felt heavy and unresponsive. By the time villagers reached him, barely 20 minutes after the bite, he had collapsed on the dirt path leading toward the main road, conscious but unable to move his limbs properly. His breathing had become labored, shallow gasps as the venom attacked his respiratory system. Villagers carried Chati to a pickup truck and rushed him to the nearest hospital, approximately 30 miles away over mountain roads. The journey took nearly an hour. Upon arrival, medical staff attempted to administer anti-venom, but the hospital's supply was critically low. They managed to give him a partial dose while arranging emergency transport to a larger facility in Chiang Mai. The venom had progressed too far. Approximately 4 hours after the initial bite, Chati's respiratory muscles failed completely. Despite mechanical ventilation efforts, cardiac complications developed and he was pronounced dead. The attending physician noted in his report that the victim had sustained 2 puncture wounds consistent with king cobra envenomation. Chati's death sent ripples through the small village community. Local officials posted advisories warning farmers about the presence of king cobras. They also reminded residents that king cobras are protected wildlife and should not be confronted directly. His family held a quiet funeral, burying him at the edge of the property he had spent 2 decades cultivating. August 9, 2015, and the dry season quiet of Kruger National Park's lower rest camp sat between the acacia trees like something waiting, kind of mourning, that should have kept everyone close to shade and off the perimeter paths. Conan Dlamini was 22, a second-year business administration student. He had grown up in Polokwane, the oldest of 3 siblings, and had visited Kruger once before on a school trip. What occupied him now was content. He had built a following of around 2,000 people online by filming himself reacting to things. This weekend trip with 4 university friends was a post-exam release, and Conan had brought his selfie stick with that implicit purpose in mind. Contrary to this incident, he was apparently not known as someone who took things too far. I read that his friends described him as someone who could read a situation. I guess he simply misjudged this one. The group had wandered toward the camp's quieter eastern perimeter when one of his friends spotted the snake under a marula tree and pointed. The ground along that stretch was dry and root-crossed, shadowed by mopane and marula, exact habitat for the black mamba. Adults reach between 7 and 9 feet and are among the most efficient, venomous snakes on the continent. Their venom is almost purely neurotoxic, progressively disabling nerve-to-muscle communication from the strike site inward until the respiratory muscles can no longer contract. Without anti-venom, death from respiratory failure can occur in 20 to 60 minutes in severe cases, especially with neck or head bites, depending on venom load. A rope line between wooden posts marked the restricted boundary, with a bilingual warning sign fixed to the nearest tree. The group crossed it without discussion. Saifo and Kosi, one of Conan's friends, told a local reporter later that they had not read the sign carefully and assumed it was protecting vegetation. The snake was already in a raised posture, head lifted from its coil, when they came within range. That posture, in a mamba, means the animal has already registered a threat. Conan extended his selfie stick toward it, likely to get the angle he wanted. His friends were still laughing when the snake moved. The first strike hit his right forearm. The footage recovered from his phone shows only a frame blur, and then the snake already withdrawn. Conan shook his arm out and looked at the punctures, small and paired. He was still smiling when the second strike landed on the left side of his neck within 4 seconds of the first. Immediately recognizing something was wrong, Conan walked toward the nearby path, and his friends helped him. They began shouting for help and moving quickly toward the ranger station. He vomited once while walking, and his sweating became noticeable on his shirt. By the time they reached a point visible from the main camp road, his limbs were noticeably weak, his steps uneven, and he required support from 2 friends to continue. They flagged down a passing vehicle carrying maintenance staff, who radioed for a ranger pickup, but the camp's internal radio system was temporarily down, causing a brief delay. On the way, Venom progressed rapidly. His speech slurred, grip weakened, and his legs gave way multiple times, forcing the friends to lift him into the vehicle. Froth formed at the corners of his mouth. Breathing became shallow and effortful, but he remained conscious enough to track movement with his eyes. The rangers who eventually met them at the edge of the camp tried to administer oxygen, but it was already too late to reverse the neurotoxic progression. Conan lost the ability to breathe independently while being transferred in the ranger vehicle. He showed no distress on his face in the final minutes. That was the detail Saifo returned to in his interview. There was no expression that told them it was ending. Coroner findings showed 2 envenomation sites confirmed, right forearm and left lateral neck. The neck strike allowed rapid venom access near major vessels, accelerating systemic spread. Cause of death was respiratory paralysis, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation consistent with black mamba. Time of death estimated within 40 to 50 minutes of first strike, consistent with severe systemic progression of mamba venom. No antivenom was administered before death. The 3 friends who stayed with Conan were treated at the camp medical station for shock. Sifo gave a brief account to a local Limpopo newspaper the following week. What made this story sad for me is that he said the part that stayed with him was how ordinary it looked from the outside, that they were trying to help someone they knew, and then they weren't. The black mamba was located that evening and captured and safely relocated by trained park wildlife staff deeper into the reserve, following standard Kruger snake handling protocols. It was February 19th, 2015, and the red dirt plains outside Broken Hill, New South Wales, had already begun to radiate heat by mid-morning, the kind that warps the air above the ground into something that looks alive. Mara Wynn, 34, had spent the better part of 6 years building a reputation in amateur herpetology circles as someone who got the shot no one else could. Based out of Canberra, she worked weekdays as a lab technician at a university research facility and spent most of her accumulated leave chasing reptiles across remote stretches of the Australian interior. Her photographs had appeared in 2 independent wildlife journals and a handful of enthusiast publications. She was not a scientist by formal credential, but she carried herself with the confidence of one. Colleagues who had worked alongside her described her as sharp, capable, but occasionally dismissive of protocols she considered overly cautious. Again, overconfident. This was her 3rd trip to Broken Hill, aimed at documenting the inland taipan up close, a goal she'd pursued for 2 years, with researcher Declan Ford assisting. She told him it would be different, seeking unprecedented close-range footage, which should have been a warning. The rocky outcrops near the barrier range offered broken shade and narrow crevices that concentrated heat, ideal basking conditions for the inland taipan. The species is, by toxicological measure, the most venomous terrestrial snake on Earth. A single bite delivers enough venom to kill more than 100 adult humans. In the wild, it typically remains partially concealed and will retreat if given a clear escape route, striking only when it feels cornered within tight cover. That morning, a posted notice warned of confirmed venomous reptile activity in the rocky terrain ahead. Broken Hill Rangers had logged increased sightings after a warm spell. Declan read the sign aloud, but Mara kept walking. About 40 minutes in, Declan spotted a pale, smooth-scaled snake, partly withdrawn in an 8-inch wide rock crevice. He called for Mara to mark the spot and hold, but she was already crouching with her camera. What Declan saw next, from roughly 30 feet away, was Mara lowering herself onto one knee and extending her bare right hand toward the crevice. He shouted. She raised her left hand briefly in his direction without looking back. She said that she was adjusting the angle, trying to shift the snake's position to catch the available light. The strike was not visible from where Declan stood. What he heard was a sharp intake of breath, and then Mara said something low that he could not make out. She pulled her hand back and stood upright. 2 rapid strikes had landed in quick succession, leaving multiple closely spaced puncture marks between her thumb and index finger. She pressed her other hand over the site. The inland taipan's fangs had penetrated cleanly. The venom was already moving. Declan did not know this. For some reason, Mara did not tell him that she was bit. Within 15 minutes, Mara's face had gone the color of chalk. She sat against a rock and said she felt nauseated. Her hand had swollen through the wrist and into the lower forearm. That's when Declan knew. He immediately called for emergency services. He tried to stay calm and applied AE, pressure, immobilization bandage from the field kit, wrapping firmly from the fingers upward and securing her arm to limit movement. But Mara was already sweating through her shirt despite the partial shade. She began to shiver. Her breathing became audible, slightly labored, irregular in its rhythm. By 40 minutes post-bite, she was on the ground, legs folding without warning. She was conscious, but not responding coherently. Her skin had taken on a grayish undertone. The nearest ambulance was dispatched from Broken Hill. Terrain and distance meant it took just over an hour to reach them. A landing zone was identified nearby for the air ambulance during that interval. By the time paramedics arrived at the scene, Mara was unconscious. She was airlifted to Broken Hill Base Hospital. During the flight, her breathing continued to deteriorate, becoming shallow and irregular despite assisted support, and a faint line of blood later appeared at her nostril as coagulopathy developed. She went into cardiac arrest shortly after landing. The coroner's report noted acute envenomation consistent with inland taipan bite with systemic coagulopathy, progressive paralysis leading to respiratory failure, and hypoxic cardiac arrest as contributing factors. Mara's camera was recovered undamaged. The photographs on it were from earlier that morning: a juvenile skink on a flat stone, a dry creek bed, boot prints in red dirt. Declan and 2 colleagues held a small memorial at the campsite that evening. I'd say she died doing what she loved. It was January 14th, 2014, and the cramped chicken coop on the outskirts of Kampong Cham felt smaller than ever, the low ceiling forcing anyone inside to crouch while moving. That night, a massive Burmese python had already made its way into space, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sokum Dara, 51, had spent decades building his small farm, raising chickens for both his family and extra income. He was a careful man, known for tending his birds meticulously. Lately, though, 6 chickens had gone missing, and Dara's frustration grew. He decided to stay overnight in the coop, hoping to catch the culprit. At first, Dara assumed the thief was a human. He imagined a neighbor or passerby sneaking in under cover of night to take his chickens, thinking about the footprints he might see or the shadows he might catch. I can picture him sitting there, crouched among the chickens, flashlight in hand, legs cramping, thinking he's ready for whatever comes, but not knowing what's really waiting. The coop was tiny, only 8 by 12 feet. Every corner was within reach, leaving little room to dodge anything large. Burmese pythons can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 160 pounds. Their strength is terrifying. They can crush ribs and stop blood flow in minutes. In confined spaces, they use every surface for leverage. Dara probably thought he was in control, but the space gave the snake the upper hand. I keep thinking about how claustrophobic that must have felt. Walls so close that every move became a risk. Earlier signs should have warned him. Villagers had talked about increased python activity after the seasonal flooding, and a neighbor had found a large shed skin nearby. Chickens were acting stressed, squawking at night, huddling unnaturally. I can almost hear that frantic clucking echoing in my head, like a warning he didn't fully understand. Around midnight, the chickens erupted into chaos. Dara's flashlight illuminated the massive python coiled around one of his hens. Startled, he lunged to save. The bird slipped on the damp floor and fell directly into the snake's striking range. The serpent uncoiled and struck, wrapping firm coils around Dara's torso while pinning his left arm. The python wasn't immediately crushing him, but each struggle only made it tighten further. I hate imagining the helplessness, trying to push it away, feeling it adjust and brace itself, realizing nothing you do loosens its grip. Every movement gave the snake more leverage. Its muscles worked like a machine, tightening around Dara's chest and abdomen, then looping around his legs. The cramped coop meant he couldn't twist or get proper footing. Breathing became shallow, each gasp weak and muffled. I can feel the panic imagining it. Pressure crushing your ribs, arms pinned, and the ground slippery beneath you. Within minutes, he lost consciousness as the pressure around his chest restricted breathing and circulation. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the unusual silence and discovered Dara's body still wrapped in the python's coils. Authorities arrived about 30 minutes later, finding the snake had moved to a corner but remained in the coop. The examination showed multiple rib fractures and internal injuries consistent with prolonged constriction and asphyxiation. He was later pronounced dead from complications of his injuries. The python was nearly 17 feet long and was later relocated by wildlife officials. After Dara's death, neighboring farmers reinforced their coops and improved safety measures. His family eventually sold the property and moved closer to town. The incident became a cautionary tale, though little concrete action was taken beyond the immediate village. I keep thinking about that moment in the coop, how tiny it was. Dara didn't expect a python that large, and the confined space made escape impossible. It's hard not to feel the situation could have been avoided if he hadn't gone in, alone that night. The signs were there, the risk obvious, but I guess sometimes pride and worry about your livelihood make you take chances you shouldn't. I can't say it was careless. It was human, but yeah, this one was preventable. It was September 14th, 2014, and the humid air of Kerala's Western Ghats hung heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and decomposing vegetation, where the dense forest canopy filtered the afternoon light into dappled patterns on the jungle floor. The remote trekking trail wound through prime habitat for some of India's most dangerous reptiles, including the species responsible for thousands of deaths annually across the subcontinent. Ryan Venko was a 22-year-old backpacker from Vancouver, Canada, whose gap-year journey through Southeast Asia had been documented extensively on his travel blog. His posts consistently emphasized his willingness to take risks that other travelers avoided, and he had built a modest online following by photographing himself in increasingly dangerous situations. Friends who had traveled with Ryan described him as someone who treated local warnings as challenges rather than legitimate safety concerns. Ryan had hired a local guide for the 3-day trek through the Periyar Wildlife Sanctuary, an experienced tracker named Ravi who knew the forest, its wildlife, and exactly how dangerous both could be. Ryan had made it clear from the outset that he wasn't interested in what he called tourist-friendly experiences. Ravi had warned him specifically about the high concentration of venomous snakes that became active during the monsoon season. Ryan had nodded, and then, on the second day, wandered off alone anyway. He was following a game trail that led to a small clearing when he spotted a large snake coiled beneath a fallen log approximately 10 feet away. The snake's distinctive hood and striking black and yellow banding immediately identified it as a king cobra, one of the world's most dangerous venomous species. Ryan identified it as a content opportunity, rather than backing away slowly, as Ravi would have advised had Ryan not left Ravi behind. Ryan approached the snake with his camera, planning to capture close-up shots of what he appears to have assumed was a docile, sun-basking reptile. King cobras are the world's longest venomous snakes, capable of reaching lengths exceeding 18 feet and weighing up to 20 pounds. They can deliver large volumes of neurotoxic venom capable of killing a human without treatment, with severe cases leading to respiratory failure within 1 to several hours without ventilatory support. Ryan had approached to within 6 feet of the coiled snake when it began displaying defensive behavior. The cobra raised its head and spread its distinctive hood, a warning signal recognizable to anyone with even passing familiarity with cobras, which Ryan did not appear to have. The snake's forked tongue flicked rapidly as it assessed the threat. Instead of retreating, Ryan continued moving closer, holding his camera at arm's length to capture what he believed would be an award-winning wildlife photograph. When he extended his free hand toward the snake, apparently intending to touch its hood, the cobra struck. The snake's fangs penetrated Ryan's right hand just below his knuckles, injecting a large volume of neurotoxic venom into the tissue of his hand. The bite lasted a fraction of a second. Ryan jerked his hand back, staring at the 2 small puncture wounds already beginning to swell and discolor. The cobra struck a second time as he stumbled backward, catching his forearm before withdrawing beneath the log. The snake had done what it needed to do and returned to its log. Ryan turned and ran blindly through the forest. Within minutes, he began experiencing the first symptoms of envenomation. His vision blurred, his speech slurred. Muscle weakness spread through his limbs as the neurotoxin began its work, making it increasingly difficult to stay upright as he crashed through undergrowth, searching for the guide he had deliberately left behind. Ryan collapsed approximately 200 yards from the bite site as his respiratory system began to shut down. He managed to activate the emergency beacon on his GPS device before losing consciousness. Piece of technology he had apparently packed alongside his camera, but not his judgment. Ravi found Ryan's body 3 hours later, guided by the GPS signal. A helicopter evacuation was attempted, but Ryan was pronounced dead before reaching medical facilities. The cause of death was respiratory failure, secondary to king cobra envenomation. The remote location made survival impossible, even with immediate intervention, which Ryan had ensured would not be available by separating from his guide in a forest he did not know, to photograph a snake he did not understand, for a blog that had a modest following. It was August 3rd, 2018, when the dry heat of late winter settled over a small rural property near Mackay, Queensland, Australia. By noon, a young farmhand named Lachlan Hargrove would be the victim of a dangerous belief. Lachlan was 24 years old, a wiry and sun-weathered farmhand who had worked on various properties around Mackay since dropping out of technical college at 19. He lived in a converted shed on the edge of a cattle property, spending most evenings online. His co-workers described him as confident to the point of recklessness, the type who would handle farm equipment without proper safety gear, and who dismissed most warnings as overcautious. Lachlan had become obsessed with building immunity to snake venom after reading dubious TikTok claims about mithridatism. Over 6 months, he deliberately allowed bites from non-venomous and mildly venomous snakes, documenting symptoms like nausea, swelling, and weakness, always recovering without medical help. His friend Mason, a 26-year-old mechanic next door, witnessed several bites and repeatedly warned him, but Lachlan dismissed the concerns, trusting internet forums. What Lachlan either didn't understand or chose to ignore was the lethality of the species that inhabited this region. Eastern brown snakes are the second most venomous land snakes in the world, responsible for more deaths in Australia than any other snake species. Unlike some snake venoms that cause obvious swelling and necrosis at the bite site, brown snake venom often produces minimal local symptoms, giving victims false reassurance while the toxins spread rapidly through the bloodstream. As little as a few milligrams of venom may be sufficient to kill an adult human within 30 minutes, to a few hours without immediate anti-venom treatment. That morning, Mason arrived around 10:30 a.m. to find Lachlan walking the fence line with a stick, Lachlan planned another bite from a more venomous snake, claiming prior nausea and weakness showed his body was adapting. They walked along the eastern boundary, grass thick and snake-prone. Lachlan spotted a 4-foot brown snake near a rotting post and approached it despite Mason's warnings. The snake, sensing the threat, raised its head and flattened its neck in a defensive posture. Lachlan extended his left hand toward it. The snake struck with lightning speed, its fangs puncturing the flesh between his thumb and index finger. Lachlan jerked his hand back, laughing nervously as he examined the 2 small puncture wounds. There was minimal bleeding and almost no pain, a deceptive sign that would prove fatal. For the first few minutes, Lachlan seemed fine. He showed Mason the bite marks, pointing out how small they were compared to previous bites. But within 15 minutes, his expression changed. He mentioned feeling dizzy when they got home and sat down heavily in the sofa. Mason noticed sweat beginning to bead on Lachlan's forehead, despite the relatively mild temperature. Lachlan's face had gone pale. After a few more minutes, Lachlan vomited violently, bringing up his breakfast in convulsive heaves. Mason grabbed him by the shoulders, asking if they should go to the hospital. Lachlan waved him off again, insisting it was normal and that he just needed to lie down, saying the sickness always passed if he slept it off. Mason hesitated, but stayed beside him, watching as Lachlan's pulse became weak and irregular, and his skin developed a grayish pallor. Within roughly 30 minutes after the bite, Lachlan lost coordination and slumped, showing early signs of cardiovascular collapse. Mason kept talking to him, trying to keep him responsive, but Lachlan drifted in and out, eventually falling still. At first, Mason believed he had simply passed out from the nausea. He sat beside him, monitoring his breathing, as instructed by past first aid advice he'd heard, keeping Lachlan's arms still and elevated. For several minutes, Lachlan's chest rose and fell unevenly, long pauses separating shallow breaths. Small spots of bruising appeared on his skin, indicative of early internal bleeding from coagulopathy. Emergency services were contacted shortly after, when Mason could not rouse him. By the time responders arrived, Lachlan was unresponsive and pulseless. Despite resuscitation efforts and the administration of anti-venom, he showed no recovery. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner said Lachlan died because the brown snake's venom caused his heart and blood circulation to fail. The venom triggered internal blood clotting problems and small brain bleeds. They also saw old snake bite marks on his arms and legs, showing he had been deliberately exposing himself to bites before. His family, devastated by the loss, learned only afterward about his dangerous experiments. Mason requested privacy and never gave a public statement. It was September 15, 2017, and the Western Ghats had been under monsoon rains. For weeks, the forest floor turned to dark, compressed leaf rot, the canopy holding water long after the clouds moved through. The kind of terrain where the distance between something hidden and something visible is almost nothing. Arjun Pillai, 52, from the Palakka district of Kerala, had spent nearly 2 decades operating at the edges of the wildlife trade. His wife had died years earlier. His 2 older children had moved away. Neighbors described him as quiet and rarely employed in any legitimate sense. What sustained him financially was a network of brokers who paid well for live reptiles, juvenile king cobras in particular, which moved easily through underground markets in Southeast Asia. He had made this kind of trip dozens of times and returned without incident, and I think that record had long since hardened into something resembling certainty. He brought his son, Kavi, 16, likely for practicality. The boy was quiet, could carry collection bags, and knew not to ask unnecessary questions. Kavi had accompanied him on 2 prior trips without protest. This morning he protested. He said the undergrowth near the nest looked disturbed. He said they should turn back. Arjun did not respond. The forest in the Western Ghat during late monsoon is dense enough to conceal anything at ground level. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes in the world, capable of exceeding 10 to 12 feet. Unlike nearly all other species, they construct nests and actively guard them. A nest-guarding adult will not retreat. The venom is potent, capable of causing severe neurotoxic paralysis in humans. In untreated adult humans, death can occur, but documented fatalities generally develop over 1 to several hours. Forest Department rangers had circulated informal warnings to nearby villages the prior week following a confirmed sighting in the same buffer zone. A retired forest watcher who knew Arjun had told him directly that the area was active and that 2 local men had already abandoned the trail. Arjun apparently nodded and said nothing. That morning, less than 20 yards from the nest site, Kavi spotted a shed skin caught in the lower brush, nearly translucent, intact, longer than either of them. He stopped. Arjun stepped over it and kept moving. At the nest, a compressed mound of decaying vegetation pressed against a granite outcrop. Arjun crouched and peered into the undergrowth. He told Kavi to hold the bag open. He reached his right arm into the brush. Now I know he's been in this trade for a long time, but reaching an arm into a snake's den? Has he just been lucky until this moment? The cobra raised its hood and made a brief hissing display before striking. It struck across the forearm just below the elbow. The impact was audible. He recoiled briefly, but then grabbed the snake, likely in a panicked attempt to control it. It struck 2 more times, once on the right index finger, once across the palm. He swung his machete, repeatedly, eventually severing the snake in sections. The detached head lay in the leaf litter, jaw moving reflexively. Kavi said that he was stunned, unsure how to react, because this is the first time this ever happened. At first, they started hauling the eggs to the bag, but within minutes, swelling tracked visibly up the forearm toward the elbow. Arjun lowered himself to the ground. Kavi stood watching his father. Then he ran. He sprinted nearly 2 miles through wet, uneven terrain to the nearest paved road and flagged down a passing truck, which drove him to the village. Villagers reached the nest site approximately 1 to 1.5 hours after the first strike. Arjun was supine and unresponsive. The severed snake, the machete, and 3 visible bite sites on his right arm and hand established the sequence of events. He later died at the village clinic. Cause of death was severe neurotoxic envenomation, leading to acute respiratory failure, consistent with king cobra. Multiple bite wounds on the right forearm, right index finger, and right palm. Arjun was buried without a formal service. The forest department filed an incident report noting the poaching equipment recovered at the scene: collection bags, a wire snare, and 2 plastic transport containers. With the offender deceased, no charges were pursued. Kavi Pillai was taken in by his maternal uncle in Coimbatore. A welfare program affiliated with the Kerala Forest Department helped cover his schooling costs. He sat his secondary exams in 2019, passed, and enrolled that autumn in an electrical trades program at a polytechnic college in Thrissur. I think that if his father was still alive, Kavi wouldn't be given this opportunity. It was October 4th, 2016, on a citrus farm outside Tsenin, Limpopo, when a man was about to make a grave mistake with the sudden violence of fang and muscle. Peter Botha, 34, had worked the Loveld his entire adult life. At Marula Ridge Farm, where he had been employed for 6 years, foremen trusted him with equipment and difficult labor. He was physically capable, rarely sick, and known for making decisions quickly and rarely reversing them. He had no formal training in wildlife handling, but had picked up small, non-venomous snakes on farm property before: house snakes, juvenile pythons. His work that Tuesday was straightforward: clear, overgrown citrus rows ahead of the weekend harvest alongside co-worker Dion Erasmus, 29. Both men had been at it since early morning under a clear October sky. The eastern grove runs close to a Letaba River tributary where fever trees and scrub shade the irrigation channels below. Limpopo Loveld in early October sits at the edge of the wet season, warm, humid, and alive with insects and the animals that hunt them. The boomslang is a rear-fanged colubrid capable of reaching 5 feet in length. Its body slender, and its eyes disproportionately large. Its venom is hemotoxic, methodically dismantling the blood's clotting system and triggering disseminated intravascular coagulation, a cascading failure in which clotting factors are consumed until hemorrhage becomes uncontrollable from within. Dion spotted the snake first, coiled in the crook of a fever tree branch, about 4 feet off the ground. Vivid green, with large, motionless eyes. He told Peter to leave it and move to the next row. Farm management had circulated a written notice earlier that season about increased snake sightings near the irrigation channels following upstream flooding, advising workers to report encounters to the site supervisor rather than engage. Peter had been present at that briefing. He stepped toward the tree regardless, studying the snake from about 3 feet away. He reached up and attempted to grab the boomslang behind the head with his bare right hand, but his grip slipped almost immediately along the narrow neck. Dion, standing about 16 feet back, shouted at him to let it go. The snake bit once, a brief latch. Rather than a quick tap, its jaws working for a second before Peter pulled free. With contact to the palm of Peter's right hand, he released it, and the snake dropped into the brush and was gone. He held his hand up and looked at it. A small puncture, faint redness around the entry point, nothing more. He told Dion it felt like a bee sting. Neither man called the farm supervisor. Over the following 2 hours, he reported a mild headache and a heavy, fatigued feeling as bruising spread slowly across his palm and up into his wrist, pooling dark and soft beneath the skin. They improvised a tourniquet from a shirt sleeve cinched above the elbow and pressed a compress of crushed wild herbs, used locally for insect bites, against the wound. He held his arm elevated against a fence post, flexing his fingers periodically through the afternoon. The pain remained dull, and the swelling moved gradually enough that neither man treated it as an emergency. By 4 p.m., roughly 5 hours after, the bite. Peter's gums bled when he pressed his tongue to them. A shallow scratch on his forearm from the morning's brush clearing oozed steadily and would not close. He vomited once near the irrigation line and sat down on a root. The skin of his hand and forearm had turned mottled purple-black from the wrist upward, the tissue beneath swollen and tight. He was pale and moving with the deliberate slowness of someone trying not to fall. The whites of his eyes had turned visibly blood red from hemorrhage rather than clear. Dayon began calling the clinic in Sanin, about 12 miles away, at 5 p.m. He made 3 calls over 40 minutes. A nurse on the final call told him to bring Peter immediately and advised them to keep him still and remove any constriction, though the tourniquet remained in place. By then, his eyes were fully bloodshot with pooled hemorrhage. He was semi-conscious when they loaded him into the farm bakkie. He grew increasingly unresponsive during the drive, his breathing shallow and uneven. Emergency personnel met them on the road approximately 40 minutes after the final call. Peter had no pulse. Paramedics initiated resuscitation briefly, but found no response and no signs of reversible cause. He was pronounced dead. Peter was buried on family land east of Sanin 4 days after his death. To be honest, I can't muster any sympathy for a man who was explicitly warned at a farm briefing, told by his co-worker to leave it alone, and still reached barehanded for a boomslang, then shrugged off a bite as a bee sting, slapped on a tourniquet and some herbs, and waited until his eyes bled to call for help. It was August 12, 2018, and the small wildlife park outside Polokwane should have been a fun stop on Leora's trip. But that day, it became a disaster waiting to happen. Thick concrete barriers and glass separated visitors from the snakes, and yet one wrong step would turn everything upside down. Leora Dane, 29, had built a modest following on her social media platform, always chasing the next daring shot. I can picture her scrolling through her feed earlier that morning, thinking she needed something epic for this post. She had a reputation among her friends for ignoring warnings and pushing limits, brushing off caution as unnecessary. That afternoon, the 15-foot king cobra appeared still behind the glass enclosure, and Leora thought she could handle it. I keep imagining her confidence, her arm stretching over the barrier, believing she was safe. Her friends egged her on, filming every move with their phones. They thought the glass and concrete were enough to keep her safe, but the snake didn't read the script. King cobras are large and fast, and even slight disturbance in close range can trigger a rapid defensive strike. It's the kind of thing you think you can control until reality hits. Then, there's no control at all. When Leora reached over the barrier, her hand moved just past the designated viewing boundary, briefly entering the snake's immediate strike range near the enclosure glass. The king cobra reacted instantly, lifting and driving its head forward in a rapid defensive strike and biting her forearm before she could fully retract her arm. The contact lasted only a moment, but it was enough for staff to immediately recognize what had happened and move in. Staff reacted within seconds, stepping in with controlled urgency to pull her back from the enclosure and secure the surrounding area so no one else could approach. The response was fast and coordinated, focused on separating her from any further risk while assessing her condition. I can't stop picturing how quickly she must have realized what had happened, the shock setting in almost immediately. Within minutes, she began showing early signs of neurotoxic envenomation, starting with slurred speech and a noticeable loss of control in her facial and throat muscles. Her breathing gradually became more labored, with short, shallow attempts to inhale becoming more frequent. She remained conscious, but increasingly weak, and was placed under close medical monitoring as responders initiated immediate treatment and prepared for possible respiratory support using rapid stabilization measures. Paramedics arrived shortly after and transported her to hospital while she was still conscious but weak and unstable. She was placed on ventilatory support as respiratory weakness progressed. Over the following hours, her breathing continued to deteriorate due to neurotoxic effects. And despite intensive resuscitation efforts, she later died in hospital from respiratory failure caused by king cobra envenomation. The park shut the exhibit for review, raising barriers and adding briefings. Leora's case was later used in internal safety reviews and public awareness materials about enclosure risk. Local news covered the incident moderately, highlighting how a brief lapse in judgment near a wildlife enclosure can lead to a serious medical emergency that develops rapidly after exposure. Honestly, it makes me think twice about even leaning over a railing near a wild animal. Looking back, I don't think Leora was reckless out of stupidity. She underestimated the danger, but it was completely preventable. The warnings were clear, the barriers were there for a reason, and even a brief moment of overconfidence was enough to put her in real danger. If I were there, I would have stayed back. Some animals are simply too strong and too fast to play with, no matter how brave you think you are.